The new South Korean president calls for national unity as he seeks a path forward for the country. We have more in Press Perspective today. Hello and welcome to Press Perspective for this Thursday, June 5th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sunhee. It's day 2 for President Lee Jae-myung at the nation's top office, having won the snap election that took place this past Tuesday. Today we continue our conversation with members of the foreign media about the latest political event here in South Korea and its broader implications. For more, I have Chloe Borgnon with French broadcaster France 24 here in the studio. Chloe, as always, thank you for being here.
Hello, it's always a pleasure to be here.
I also have Thomas Maresca with American news agency UPI with us as well. Thomas, welcome back.
Thanks, great to be here.
Chloe, we'll start with your thoughts then regarding the outcome of the presidential election that took place this past Tuesday, keeping in mind, of course, the political turmoil here in the country over the past few months.
Yeah, so there's one point I would like to focus on was the interesting voting turnout that we found for this election. So 79.4% of the people were listed and who could vote voted, which is the highest in 28 years. We got very close to the record of 1997, that was 80%. What I would want to talk about is, so it was record participation, was already seen on the previous days when it was possible to for all early voting. And it's interesting because it kind of looked, obviously it's easy to say that afterwards, but the outcome kind of looked obvious because Lee Jae-myung had been ruling at the head of all the polls, opinion polls, since December. I went to the last meeting of the candidate, Lee Jae-myung, on the day before election, and then there I spoke also with people who were not going to vote for him. One of the person I met was kind of saying that he was not really happy with the idea that he would be the president, but he was kind of sure he would become president. But then he still told me, he was like, I'm still going to vote tomorrow. And I find it interesting because there's a lot of cases where when the president is the candidate is kind of obvious, the winner is kind of obvious, you can have the idea of, if you're not on that side, a kind of despair and you just not go to vote because why even bother? So I think it's interesting to see the turnout. There was the question of, would that vote be seen as a verdict for everything that happened in the last 6 months? I'm not sure if we can say that. I guess we will probably see it a bit further away, but the fact that Lee Jae-myung ended up with a bit less than 50% of the votes for him were probably not that clear of a message yet. But it's interesting to see, but no, it's also still shows a bit of tension, the fact that everyone wanted to get their voice heard, even the people who were against President Lee Jae-myung. And so it was also maybe a bit of a critique against the Democratic Party. I feel like it's something that might be talked about a bit more later on.
Right. And Thomas, what about you? What's your take on the result of Korea's presidential election?
Well, I think obviously the result wasn't a surprise. It certainly was Lee Jae-myung's to lose. And, definitely a lot of the support, at least that kind of energized his supporters, was, I think, people I spoke to, certainly mentioned this, kind of a repudiation or a judgment day for Yoon and the attempted martial law, and sort of that played out as a vote against Kim Un-soo and the People Power Party. So I mean, there was a sense of it was a lot of energy and it was a high turnout, as Chloe mentioned. And I think for some it did feel like there was an existential choice going on. I mean, not just obviously for Lee Jae-myung supporters, but even the way it was sort of framed by the supporters of some of the supporters of Kim Un-soo and the People Power Party. They were kind of framing it as Lee Jae-myung is going to become a dictator, and they sort of, I mean, there was a bit still of this hangover of these last 6 months of this real battle within the society. I would say, obviously, Lee Jae-myung is still facing a lot of these challenges and divisions going forward, but just very quickly, I mean, I do think South Korean democracy deserves some praise for how this all played out, and to think that 6 months, it was exactly 6 months after this martial law attempt, took place to go through that whole process, impeachment, and then get to an election and a president, having a new president without too much chaos or disruption, really, in the big picture of things, is worthy of praise. I mean, I think South Korea should take a bow on the global stage, and I think now the question going forward is obviously, Lee Jae-myung on the one hand does have a unified government, a majority in parliament, so that's an advantage for him in terms of pushing his agenda. The questions are going to be, he campaigned moving much more towards a sort of a centrist approach to try to appeal to the broadest audience, but he comes more traditionally from a sort of progressive background. So we'll see now what his policies actually look like once he's got control. But at least for a couple of days, it's a moment where you can sort of take a deep breath and after this 6 months of chaos, basically, and at least hope the future will be a little more stable going forward.
Right. Chloe, as Thomas earlier mentioned, quite a number of pundits believe that the outcome of this latest snap election is further proof of the strength of Korea's democracy. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would say definitely. I would agree with that. That's also, since martial law, we've been speaking a lot, I think, as foreign correspondent as well, about the resilience of democracy, of Korean democracy. Lee Jae-myung himself was speaking about the K-democracy. And I do believe that what we saw on the 3rd was the proof that Korean democracy is strong and is resilient. So just obviously the other, we saw that everything went really easy. The other candidates did recognize their defeat in time. They were on election night, I would say there were no tension, no visible tension at least. I was next to the National Assembly where some of Lee Jae-myung supporters were there to celebrate. And even on the moment we heard the first out of voting polls, everything was quite quiet, was quite calm, was just in the moment. So I would say that's something that has to be praised. As Thomas just said, I would agree on that point, is South Korean democracy has shown that it was resilient. And on Inauguration Day, so yesterday, we saw that President Lee is also obviously is viewing it as he has a responsibility. So he was saying that he wants to be a leader that serves the people, that don't lead. And he also said that he wants to be a president for all, recognizing that he knows some people are not supporting him, and he recognized it. But then I will say also that for the Korean democracy, there is a few dangers that have to be seen. So I would say the Democratic Party and Lee Jae-myung have to be careful of a few things. So obviously, division is still quite strong in the country at multiple levels, so gender, geographical as well, between the different ages as well. So I think it's something that still has to be taken into account. There was an election, but everything is not over. Consequences are still there. And again, as Thomas said, we've seen some observers and some critics of the Democratic Party who are being a bit scared of political revenge or scared of dogmatism, because they are afraid that because the president has the executive and legislative majority, there might be a risk of dogmatism. So I would just say he has to be quite careful on that to show that he's willing to include other as well, for the democracy to be seen as very strong here in Korea.
Right. With regard to political polarization, Thomas, as Chloe mentioned, one task for the president will be to bridge the gap among people here in the country. We are not naive. We understand this is going to be a very challenging task. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, he certainly has said the right things about it. I mean, he's stressed quite a lot through his campaign, and certainly that was his message in his taking office speech, stressing unity, talking about being a president for all Koreans, saying it's no longer progressive problems and conservative problems. He even mentioned, I'll take ideas from Park Chung-hee or Lee Dae-jung, like just I'm willing to Kim Dae-jung, sorry, yeah, willing to take ideas from all points along the political spectrum. So he certainly says that, and I think we were discussing this a little bit before the show. At the same time, there's the national there's the National Assembly, there's people in his own party that still want to, conduct investigations, and there's a sense of, how much will this be about retribution versus, there should obviously be some level of accountability for some of the things that happened, but, does it become a revenge tour? I mean, that's a big question mark. And, obviously Lee Jae-myung is also just himself a very polarizing figure, as much as he's kind of tacked towards the center to this campaign. He's got a built-in opposition that really looks at him as kind of the devil incarnate or something. So that's going to be hard for him to sort of win over his enemies kind of on the other side of the spectrum. And he himself is facing legal challenges that are yet to be resolved. I mean, we know that he's got the election law conviction that was thrown out, but then the appeal was overturned by the Supreme Court, so that is going to come up for this hearing. And then he's got several other cases that are pending, and so there's a question of, will the president be immune while in office? Does that apply to things that happened before he took office? And this is going to become a question that the Constitutional Court may have to answer, and you could see that leading into some sense of a constitutional crisis, or this argument that, he's using this power in this kind of dictatorial fashion. So those are some, possible stumbling blocks ahead. And yes, and I think even the results of the election, he won by a lot, but you still saw, Kim Moon-soo had 41%, Lee Jun-suk had something like 8%, so that's almost half and half, and we've seen some so there is those divisions still, even though, Lee Jae-myung had so much wind at his back in this election, so that's going to happen. I mean, I think Lee Jae-myung has really stressed kind of strengthening democratic safeguards and constitutional reform as a way to remove some of the power that the president has to declare martial law and try to spread out some of the responsibilities in a way to kind of limit this imperial presidency that has stricken many of his predecessors. So I think that is kind of the way forward. If you can address it more from a structural perspective, that may show like, I'm willing to, I really want to fix this, but again, we'll have to see what happens once he's actually in office.
And talking about fixing things, Chloe, the French media, it touched upon the presence of gender inequality during the election campaign period. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I would say quite a lot of my French colleagues actually have been talking about the gender inequalities problem. So you had Le Monde who spoke about, he started with the misogynistic quotation that were made by one of the candidate from the Reform Party during one of the TV debates that raised, first of all, a lot of outrage from people because it was at a time where you had kids who could listen and it was quite crude vocabulary. But then it also sparked something else that was the space of female and gender issues that was put into the campaign. Libération, with a left-wing newspaper in France, also spoke about it. It was with the feminist organization during the campaign, and they had been also trying to ask to be heard. They were trying to protest and show that they were still there, and asking obviously more of the progressist candidate, but to also report on what they wanted and on the issues. Also, Marianne Celio Fioretti, here quite a few times as well, was also reporting on it. What the main point were from the French perspective was saying that women here felt like they were not heard, that they were forgotten in this campaign. Economical and partisan issues were raised first. I mean, obviously the campaign was a very short one, was a very speed-up one, because it was an election that was happening after the impeachment. But still, that's one of the points that was raised from France's point of view. And why is it important, according to French press, is that we see that this gender inequality is a strong point of division again in the society. We've been speaking about a lot of way of polarization, but if we take, for example, the votes for where it's the most massively seen is in the vote of the 20-30 years old. If we look at that, it's completely divided by gender. If we take all the votes for the male on conservative votes, so aggregating all the candidates, it's around 60% of male voters in their 20s and 30s voted for a conservative candidate. And on the opposite, if we take the same age gap bracket, but for the female it was progressist votes, was at around 57, 58%. So it's kind of complete opposite. There was also this time no female candidate, so it's a first since 2007. That could probably also help with the gender issues being kind of neglected this time. And also female were seen as being at the head of the movement for the impeachment for the President Yoon Suk-yeol. And so there's, I guess, this kind of view as well of they could have been probably heard a bit more, and that's probably why the women here in South Korea were asking for more debate, at least on those issues.
Right. Well, gender issues that were brought up during the campaign period here in the country, they were covered by the French media and, of course, the US media as well. Thomas, another urgent social task for the new leader is the country's, of course, looming population crisis. What has been shared by the president during his campaign with regard to this particular issue?
So Lee Jae-myung has laid out sort of a multifaceted approach. There's been some financial incentives, addressing work-life balance and housing support issues, which have been, some of the key complaints among younger people looking to start families. I mean, some of it are things Lee Jae-myung has said. Some are things that the Democratic Party has kind of put in the platform. Lee Jae-myung has talked about tax reform. He actually mentioned something on Facebook a while ago it's actually based on a French policy. It's this thing called family coefficient, where you take into account both income and family size, where it's like this coefficient grows with the number of family members. So the more you have, the higher the figure is, and then your income is divided by that, so it makes your taxable income lower the bigger your family gets. And he pointed to France as an example of a country using that. He's talked about improving work-life balance. He's advocated a 4.5-day work week, to provide more to parents more time, for family and child care, which has been a huge complaint among people with families or people looking to start families. He also wants to cut the number of hours worked to below the OECD average of developed countries, which is, another factor that South Korea famously has very long working hours, and there have been attempts to limit those in the past, but it sort of doesn't seem to quite land that way. And he's talked about increasing public housing supply, to allow younger families, and that's been such a topic for years and years, just how difficult it is to find affordable housing here. They said they want to have 250,000 new units available for rental during his presidency. He's talked about expanding child allowance from 100,000 to 200,000 won per month up until 18 years old. Parental leave for workers. So a lot of these, improving public child care support. So touching on a lot of levers that you can try to manipulate. I mean, whether that will actually lead to, or how much that will affect the birth rate here remains a big question. I mean, I think this idea of throwing money to the problem doesn't always help. And to go back to what Chloe was saying about this kind of deep gender division in the country, I mean, that is something that also needs to be somehow looked at. I mean, that I think is part of the problem too. Young men and young women are just getting farther and farther apart, and you're seeing this kind of response of not wanting to be married, not wanting to start families. So, there are issues that you can't necessarily address with policy, but that's where we are right now with what he's proposed.
Right. Some pundits were saying he's been saying all the right things while he was on the campaign trail, and we have to wait and see whether these are just campaign cliches or whether they were actually policy previews. Chloe, what looks to be the impact of this election result then on reinvigorating perhaps the country's slowing economy? Do you see a boost in perhaps consumer sentiment given an end, hopefully, to the political turmoil here?
Yes, I would say in this case on economy, it's always good to see what the markets are saying. This morning, Kospi market was opening with at plus 2%, a bit more than that. So that's already showing that investors are thinking like, positive or optimistic. The reason for that is that Lee Jae-myung has said that the top priorities for him are the economy. The task force has to be on economy. So he said economical revival, a pragmatic market economy and economical growth will be the first things to be implemented. It's true that there is an economical crisis looming here in South Korea. The exports are going down. There is a stagnant domestic consumption. Obviously, the Trump tariffs, because South Korea has not been able to at least paint a deal for now because there was no head of states recently. So they have until the 8th of July to really, because right now the tariffs are kind of on a break, but they haven't before 8th of July to reach a deal with the US, and that could be a bit of a, precipitated one. It's interesting to see that the nominee prime minister that's still waiting nomination, he compared this crisis to that of 1997. So it's to say how much I would say the government is aware of the crisis and the gravity of the crisis that's here. So I would say obviously main priority for the government would be to get the deal with the Trump administration on the tariffs. And then there's also another thing that has to be kind of really slowly balanced. This is the fact that until now, before all the turmoil that we saw, and before Trump came back for a second mandate, there was this thing that South Korea obviously had a very strong relationship with the United States, but it also wasn't a strong relationship, at least in the commercial states, with China. That is one of the top commercial partners with South Korea. Before last December, we saw also that China and South Korea have been trying to make more deals, partners more. The thing is, will it be possible? Will it be agreed up under Donald Trump's administration when we see the tension that really is happening in the relationship between the US and China? Will the United States ask South Korea to make a choice and to choose their partners? If it has to happen, then maybe it would be a very tricky and hard situation again for South Korea and for South Koreans' economy.
Right. For sure, the Lee Jae-myung administration's future diplomatic and defense policies are of much interest to the foreign media. Thomas, that being said, with regard to North Korea, President Lee Jae-myung has spoken about the need for conversation over confrontation. How do you see that affecting perhaps South Korea's ties with the US and Japan?
It's an interesting perspective because on the one hand, you do see areas where you think, okay, maybe Lee Jae-myung is going to kind of diverge from the close relationship with Washington, and some of, in particular perhaps with the approach toward China, South Korea. I mean, Lee Jae-myung in the past, and I think the Democratic Party in general, has taken a kind of a more multipolar view of the world, and so he has definitely stressed that we need to maintain a strong alliance with the U.S., and he's also stressed, maintaining this trilateral partnership, military kind of partnership with Japan in the mix. But he's always sort of insinuated that we need to look at our own interests and the idea that he may approach China sort of differently. So that's an area where you could see a divergence, but at the same time he has talked about wanting to re-engage with North Korea, and that actually fits more into perhaps what we think Trump may want to do. I mean, in general, Washington still hasn't paid that much attention to the Korean Peninsula yet. I mean, some of that is just other things going on in the world, but it could be some of it has been this presidential sort of vacuum. So, Lee Jae-myung mentioned in the past that he doesn't think Seoul should be sidelined if there is a new, summit or engagement with North Korea between Trump and Kim Jong-un. So, that's something that could fit into the agenda for Washington if we think that Trump does want to restart. So, there's some sides that could align and some sides that I think would be more traditionally a place of divergence. So, another thing that we're going to have to see how it works out.
Right, for sure. Time will tell then. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
And Chloe, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching.